Lonely rancher takes in a frozen Chinese bride, unaware she would change his life forever. Arthur stamped the snow from his boots on the worn planks of the train platform, the cold biting through his thick wool coat. The sky was the color of old iron, heavy with the promise of more snow. He was here for salt licks and a sack of flour, a trip he made only when necessity outweighed the bleak silence of the town. The station was nearly deserted, a few figures huddled against the wind that swept across the plains with a desolate howl. Then he saw her, a small shape of color in a world of gray and white. She stood beside a single dark suitcase, dressed in a thin prairie dress the shade of a pale pink sunrise, a color that had no business being in this brutal landscape. Her hands were tucked into her sleeves, her shoulders trembling almost imperceptibly. She was a ghost, an apparition of a gentler place, abandoned on the edge of his harsh world. People hurried past, their faces pinched and averted, as if she were a problem they refused to see. He watched as the last passenger boarded a departing carriage, and the station agent locked the door to the ticket office, casting one last dismissive glance her way. She did not move. She simply stood there, a fragile statue of porcelain and resolve, as the first flakes of the new storm began to fall. Something in him, a long dormant piece of his soul that he thought had frozen over with the land, stirred. He couldn't leave her. It wasn't a choice, it was a fact, as solid and unmovable as the mountains on the horizon. He walked over, his steps heavy in the gathering snow. She looked up, her eyes dark and deep, holding a universe of fear and exhaustion. He gestured toward the vast, empty expanse beyond the town. "Come with me," he said, the words feeling rough and unused in his throat. "It's not safe here." He led her to the horse tied near the general store, its breath pluming in the frigid air. Leanne followed a few steps behind, her grip on the handle of her suitcase white-knuckled, her movements stiff with cold and apprehension. The journey back to his ranch was silent, broken only by the crunch of hooves on snow and the rising moan of the wind. When they arrived, the cabin looked smaller than ever, a dark shape hunkered down against the immense white wilderness. Inside, the air was cold and still. It was a place built for one, for survival, not for comfort. A stone hearth dominated one wall, its ashes gray and lifeless. A narrow bed, a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs. This was his life, stripped down to its barest elements. He lit the kindling in the fireplace, the flare of the match a brief spark of defiance against the gloom. As the flames caught and began to lick at the larger logs, a weak, flickering light pushed back the shadows. He turned to find her standing just inside the door, a silhouette against the swirling snow outside. She hadn't moved. She looked at the room, her gaze sweeping over its stark emptiness, and he felt a sudden, sharp pang of something like shame. He had nothing to offer. He gestured to the fire. "Warm yourself." She hesitated, then slowly, cautiously, moved closer to the growing heat, her small suitcase still clutched in her hand as if it were an anchor. He took a heavy wool blanket from his bed and draped it over her shoulders. She flinched at his touch, a small bird-like movement, but did not pull away. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. He did not know what to do, what to say. He had brought this fragile, foreign life into his own, and now he was responsible for it, a weight he hadn't felt in years. He ladled some stew from the pot he'd left simmering over the embers that morning and placed the bowl on the table. He gestured for her to eat. She just watched him, her dark eyes unreadable. For 3 days she was a ghost in his house. Leanne moved with a quietness that was almost unnerving, a shadow that clung to the edges of the room. She spent most of her time huddled by the fire, the heavy blanket wrapped around her, her gaze lost in the shifting flames. She barely touched the food he left for her, taking only a few bites when she must have thought he wasn't looking. Her suitcase remained by her side, a silent testament to a journey interrupted, a life derailed. Arthur went about his chores with a new, thrumming awareness. The familiar routine of chopping wood, checking the fences, and tending to the livestock was now underscored by her presence. The silence of the cabin was different. It was no longer the empty silence of solitude, but a silence filled with unspoken questions, with the soft sound of another person's breathing. He found himself listening for her footsteps, for any sign that she was still there. He would return from the biting cold of the outdoors to find a log added to the fire, a small, subtle act that felt monumental. On the fourth morning, he walked in to find her sweeping the floor with his worn broom. The movements were slow, deliberate, graceful. She was not just cleaning, she was imposing a gentle order on his chaotic space. She was making a place for herself. When she saw him, she stopped, her hands tightening on the handle, as if expecting a reprimand. He just nodded, a small, awkward gesture of approval. "Thank you," he said, the words feeling inadequate. She looked down, a curtain of dark hair hiding her expression. Later that day, he tried to learn her name. He pointed to his own chest. "Arthur." He then gestured to her. She watched him, her head tilted slightly before she understood. She pointed a delicate finger at herself. "Leanne," she whispered, the name a soft musical sound in the quiet room. It was the first word she had spoken. It hung in the air between them, a fragile bridge beginning to form over the chasm of their differences. Leanne began to inhabit the small cabin, filling its empty spaces with her quiet industry. The change was gradual, almost imperceptible at first. A mended tear in his shirt, stitched with a precision he'd never seen. The potatoes for dinner, peeled and cut into impossibly uniform pieces. She moved through his home with a silent grace, transforming it without a word. One afternoon, he came in from the cold to a smell he didn't recognize. Something warm and savory, spiced with an aroma that was entirely foreign. On the stove, a pot simmered. She had taken his simple rations of salted pork and dried vegetables and created something new. He sat at the table and she served him a bowl. The broth was rich, complex, and deeply warming. It was more than just food. It was a gesture of care, an offering. He looked at her across the table, at the way the steam misted her face, and felt a warmth spread through him that had nothing to do with the stew. "It's good," he said, and the smile she gave him in return was fleeting, hesitant, but it was there. It was the first time he had seen her truly smile, and it lit her face from within. But the fragile peace of their small world was not destined to last. A rider from town brought the mail, a rare occurrence in the deep of winter. Among the advertisements for farm equipment was a letter from the bank. The tone was cold, formal, a reminder of his outstanding loan, a thinly veiled warning about the coming spring payment. Reading the words, Arthur felt the familiar knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach. The ranch had been his father's, and his father's before him. Losing it was unthinkable. As he stood by the window, staring out at the unforgiving landscape, the rider who delivered the mail spoke, his voice laced with a smug curiosity. "Heard you took in some company, Arthur. The folks in town are talking. A man's got to be careful these days." The words were a clear warning, a reminder that their isolation was an illusion. The world, with its judgments and its pressures, was never far away. The banker did not wait for spring. He arrived a week later, his horse a fine, dark contrast to the worn-out stock Arthur kept. Mr. Henderson was a man whose warmth was as artificial as the polished shine on his city boots. He surveyed the cabin's interior with a look of faint distaste, his eyes lingering on Leanne, who had retreated to the far corner of the room, her hands busy with a piece of mending. Henderson's visit was ostensibly about the loan, a friendly check-in, but his real purpose was clear from the moment he opened his mouth. "A harsh winter, Arthur," he began. his voice smooth and condescending. "Hard for a man to manage a place like this on his own, especially with distractions." His gaze flickered meaningfully toward Leanne. Arthur felt a slow anger begin to burn in his chest. "I manage just fine." Henderson smiled, a thin, unpleasant expression. "Of course, but appearances matter. The bank has a reputation to uphold. Our clients are expected to maintain certain community standards. An unmarried man living with a foreign woman, it invites speculation. It suggests instability." The threat was no longer veiled. It was laid bare on the rough-hewn table between them. "Your life, your home, is conditional. Conform, or we will take it all away." "She needed help," Arthur said, his voice low and tight. "It was the decent thing to do." "Decency is a luxury, Arthur, a luxury the bank does not finance," Henderson retorted, his tone hardening. "The spring payment is due in 2 months. I trust there will be no complications, no distractions." After he left, a poisonous silence filled the cabin. Leanne had not understood the words, but she had understood the menace in the banker's voice, the dismissive cruelty in his eyes. She watched Arthur pace the floor, his face a mask of grim frustration. She saw the letter on the table, the official heading of the bank. She understood. She was the complication, the distraction, the source of his trouble. That evening she barely ate, and the next morning Arthur found the blanket he had given her folded neatly on the chair where she slept. She was withdrawing again, building her walls back up, brick by silent brick, believing she was protecting him by disappearing once more. The world outside shrank to nothing. A blizzard descended upon the plains with a furious white violence, erasing the horizon and burying the world in a shroud of snow. The wind shrieked around the corners of the cabin, a relentless, primal scream. The external threat of the banker and the town faded, replaced by the immediate, elemental struggle for survival. For 2 days they were prisoners in the small wooden box, the storm a living thing trying to tear its way in. The temperature plummeted, and the fire became the center of their universe, a fragile bastion against the encroaching cold. On the 3rd day, the rhythmic chug of the well pump outside sputtered and died. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the storm's roar. Without water for themselves and the animals huddled in the barn, they wouldn't last long. Arthur pulled on his heaviest coat, his face set in grim lines. "Stay here. Keep the fire going." The wind tore the door from his grasp as he stepped outside, and he had to fight to force it shut again. Leanne watched from the window as he disappeared into the swirling vortex of white, a lone figure battling the monstrous indifference of nature. An hour passed, then 2. She fed the fire, her movements precise and automatic, but her eyes kept returning to the window, to the terrifying, empty whiteness. She could not just wait. Bundling herself in every spare piece of cloth she could find, she filled a pot with broth from the stew, the liquid scalding hot. Shielding it as best she could, she opened the door and stepped into the tempest. She found him in the small shed that housed the pump, his hands raw and blue, his tools slipping from his numb fingers. He was shivering violently, his movements clumsy with cold. He looked up as she entered, his eyes wide with surprise and concern. "Go back!" he yelled over the wind. "It's too cold!" She ignored him, setting down the pot and taking his frozen hands in her own. She began to chafe them, her small, warm hands working desperately to bring life back to his. He tried to pull away, but she held on, her grip surprisingly strong. In that moment, in the heart of the storm, huddled together in the freezing dark, the last of the walls between them finally collapsed. He was not just her protector, he was a man, vulnerable and freezing. And she was not a fragile burden, she was his lifeline. When the blizzard finally broke, the world was reborn. A profound silence fell over the land, wrapped in a blanket of pristine, untouched snow. The sun, pale and watery, cast long blue shadows across the drifts, making the landscape glitter as if it were scattered with diamonds. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe, but it was clean. A fresh start. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere had shifted as profoundly as the weather outside. The shared ordeal had forged a new intimacy between them, a bond of mutual reliance that needed no words. The silence was no longer heavy with uncertainty. It was a comfortable quiet, a shared space of understanding. He found himself watching her more, noticing the small things, the way she tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, the focused intensity in her eyes as she concentrated on a task, the quiet hum that sometimes escaped her lips when she was content. She, in turn, learned the rhythms of his day, having a cup of hot coffee waiting for him when he came in from his morning chores, her presence a steady, warming constant in his life. One afternoon he discovered her by the window, tending to a small, cracked pot she had unpacked from her suitcase. In it, a tiny green shoot was pushing its way through the dark soil. It was a small, stubborn sprout of life, a testament to her resilience. It was hope, cultivated in the harshest of conditions. "What is it?" he asked, his voice soft. She looked up, a rare, full smile gracing her lips. She spoke a word in her own language, a sound like music, then pointed to the pot, and then to the simmering stew on the stove. Herbs. She had carried the seeds of her home with her, determined to make something grow, to create a taste of what she had lost. He understood then that she wasn't just surviving here, she was beginning to live. The days grew longer, the light lingering for a few more precious minutes each evening. The harshness of winter began to loosen its grip, and with it, the rigid formality between Arthur and Leanne softened into something tender and new. Their communication was a tapestry woven from gestures, a handful of shared words, and the deep, intuitive understanding that grows between two people who have weathered a storm together. He taught her the English names for things: fire, table, sky, pointing and speaking the words slowly. She would repeat them, her pronunciation careful, her voice a soft echo of his own. In return, she showed him how to fold a piece of paper into the shape of a bird, a small act of magic that left him momentarily speechless. One night, the sky was exceptionally clear, a vast expanse of black velvet strewn with countless stars. He found her standing by the window, her breath fogging the cold glass, her gaze turned upward in wonder. He came to stand beside her, their shoulders almost touching. The warmth radiating from her was a palpable presence in the cool air of the cabin. He pointed through the glass. "That one," he said, his voice a low rumble. "They call it the Hunter." She looked where he pointed, her eyes tracing the shape of the constellation. She whispered a name in her own language, a name that sounded of ancient stories and faraway skies. It was a moment of profound connection, a sharing of worlds under the same silent, watchful stars. He felt an overwhelming urge to close the small distance between them. Slowly, tentatively, he reached out and his fingers brushed against hers. She didn't pull away. Instead, she turned her hand slightly, allowing his to settle over hers. It was a simple touch, skin against skin, but it carried the weight of everything unspoken between them: gratitude, companionship, and the fragile, burgeoning shoots of a deeper affection. The warmth of her hand in his was an anchor, a promise that he was no longer alone. Just as the first signs of a thaw appeared at the edges of the snowdrifts, the world intruded once more. Mr. Henderson returned, his demeanor colder than the winter wind. He did not bother with pleasantries this time. He dismounted and strode to the cabin door with the air of a man who owned everything he saw. "Arthur," he said, his voice clipped and devoid of any pretense of friendliness, "the board has reviewed your account. Given your unstable living situation, we've decided to call in a portion of your loan. You have 30 days to produce $500 or we will begin foreclosure proceedings." It was a death sentence. $500 was an impossible sum, more money than Arthur saw in an entire year. It was a transparent, cruel maneuver designed to force him out, to punish him for his quiet defiance. Despair, cold and heavy, settled over Arthur. He saw his future crumbling, the legacy of his family slipping through his fingers like dust. He slumped into a chair at the table after Henderson left, the banker's ultimatum echoing in the silence. He didn't know how to fight this. He had nothing. Leanne watched him from across the room, her expression filled with a deep, knowing sorrow. She had seen the defeat in his eyes, the slump of his shoulders. She disappeared into the small alcove that served as her room and returned a moment later carrying her dark suitcase. She placed it on the table and opened the clasps. He had assumed it held only clothes, remnants of her old life. He was wrong. She lifted the top layer of simple garments to reveal a breathtaking treasure. Bolts of silk, shimmering even in the dim cabin light, were nestled within. One was the color of liquid gold, another the deep, iridescent blue of a twilight sky, embroidered with silver threads that formed blossoms and cranes. It was a dowry, a fortune, a life she had been meant to live with someone else. She pushed the suitcase toward him. Her eyes met his, and in their depths he saw not sacrifice, but a fierce, unwavering resolve. "For this," she said, her voice quiet but firm as she placed her palm flat on the table. "Our home." The sale of the silks was a quiet, somber affair. Arthur took them to a merchant in a town 2 days' ride away, a man known for his discretion and his appreciation for fine goods from the East. He felt a profound sense of guilt as he traded the beautiful, intricate fabrics, the embodiment of Leanne's past and her stolen future, for a stack of worn banknotes. Yet he also felt the fierce, protective strength of her gesture. It was not his sacrifice, but theirs. When he returned with the money, enough to satisfy Henderson and secure them through the next year, the relief that washed over him was immense. But it was secondary to the new reality that had settled in the cabin. The transaction had solidified their partnership, transforming them from a man and his ward into a unit, a family forged in adversity. They stood together against the world. With the threat of foreclosure lifted, a palpable lightness entered their home. The coming of spring was no longer a deadline, but a promise. The snow receded, revealing the dark, rich earth beneath. The air softened, carrying the scent of damp soil and the distant promise of green. They worked together, preparing the land for planting. He taught her how to mend the fences, and she showed him which wild plants growing along the creek were edible. They fell into a rhythm, a silent dance of shared work and quiet companionship. Their life was simple, stripped of all but the essentials, but it was full. It was a life built on a foundation of mutual respect and a slowly deepening love that had grown, like the herbs in her pot, out of the harshest of winters. One evening, as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange that reminded him of the dress she'd worn the day they met, they stood on the small porch of the cabin. The lonely ranch was no longer lonely. It was filled with the quiet warmth of her presence. He reached for her hand, and this time she met him halfway, her fingers lacing through his with a natural, unhesitating ease. He looked out at the vast, sprawling land that was theirs, truly theirs now, and then he looked at her. He didn't need a shared language to know that they were home.